Of all the creatures on our home planet, this could be the only animal that could survive harsh conditions on Mars. The tardigrade. These fellas have another name because of their unusual looks: water bears or moss piglets. They live literally everywhere across the globe, from coastal dunes to mountains, from the lush Amazon rainforests to the barren landscapes of Antarctica. Some live on land, but tardigrades are creatures that need water around their bodies to enable gas exchange and generally stay hydrated. That's why they prefer soil, moss, or leaves covered with a layer of water. And since they're aquatic creatures, they usually choose freshwater bodies like lakes, rivers, and ponds. You haven't come across these cool animals before because they're only 0.02 inches long. You can barely perceive them with the unaided eye. But since they're virtually immortal, we can assume they've developed some amazing survival tactics. If we loaded them in a tiny spaceship and sent them to Mars, they'd be a little shocked at first, especially because of the temperature. Sure, they can live through a wide range, even going below minus 458 degrees Fahrenheit and up to 302 degrees Fahrenheit. And Mars might seem like a very hot planet when you see it in pictures, but the temperatures there are actually low, way lower than on Earth. I mean, it's farther from the sun and has a thin atmosphere, so temperatures there can drop to minus 200 degrees Fahrenheit or go up to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. On Earth, the lowest temperature was recorded in Antarctica. It was minus 128.6 degrees Fahrenheit, while the highest occurred in California, 134 degrees Fahrenheit. Tardigrades are also pretty resilient when it comes to strong pressure. They can take one that's 6 times bigger than the pressure at the bottom of the ocean. Now, for every 33 feet you go down below the surface, the pressure doubles. So, at a depth of 2.4 miles, the pressure is 380 times greater than at the surface. And in the very deepest parts of the ocean, it can be 1,100 times greater. The pressure on the red planet is about 6 times stronger than in the ocean depths. So I guess it's a little bit too much. It would be hard for these little creatures to adjust to such conditions. They would have to evolve through the next few generations to become even more resilient so that they could enjoy their time on Mars more. The food could be one of their main problems though. Some tardigrades mostly eat plants like moss, algae, or some flowering ones, and they like them served with a portion of bacteria. Others are carnivores that eat smaller tardigrades or other microscopic organisms. Well, they'd find nothing like this on Mars. So I guess we'd have to fill their tiny spaceships with lots of stashes of food they would be able to pull inside their tubular mouths. Now we're getting to the really tricky part: water. The red planet is a dry and dusty desert today. But come on, look at all those riverbanks and dried up deltas. Water must have flowed on its surface a long time ago. It's hard to understand where it all went, but it's highly possible most of the ancient water ended up trapped within minerals on the planet's crust. Some older research suggested that most of this water had escaped into space when the sun's radiation had ruined the atmosphere of Mars. But a new study has shown that only a little bit of water escaped, while most of it is still there, hidden and waiting for us to discover it. Also, a few years ago, researchers found signs of hydrated minerals on the slopes of the red planet, where they saw mysterious darkish streaks that seemed to flow. It mostly happens during warm seasons, since they fade when it gets cooler. These downhill flows could be evidence of real liquid water on Mars. Scientists have discovered some minerals that confirm this idea too. These minerals can lower the freezing point of water like salt does on icy roads. That's why scientists think there might be a shallow underground flow of briny water that causes these streaks. Tardigrades probably have excellent instincts, considering they can survive even in the toughest conditions. So they'd probably find water on Mars way before us. But even if they didn't do it right away, they would still have their tactics to stay alive for a while. If this creature loses 99% of its water content, it can survive by pausing most of its vital functions. It can remain in such a state for a couple of years. Tardigrades can absorb extremely strong impacts that would easily crush other animals, including us. They can withstand radiation levels so high that they could destroy a human. And even if we do send tardigrades to Mars one day, that won't be their first trip to space. In 2019, a spacecraft went to the moon, carrying thousands of tardigrades, the first lunar library, human DNA samples, and a DVD-sized archive that contained 30 million pages of information. The idea was to create archives of all the knowledge the human race had collected. But seconds before the spacecraft had to land, the mission control lost contact with it, and it crashed into the surface of the moon. The team was wondering what was going to happen with the spacecraft's cargo. After lots of discussion and analysis, they assumed that the library had survived, and even crazier, perhaps tardigrades had too. They were in this dehydrated kind of dormant state, so they shriveled up into tiny balls. They lowered their metabolism and expelled most of the water from their bodies, waiting for a better environment where they could be their best selves once again. These creatures can stay like this for decades and survive extremely harsh conditions. And this wasn't the first organized tour to space for tardigrades. In 2007, a team of scientists sent a group of these tiny water bears to orbit our home planet on the outside of a rocket for 10 days. They did pretty well, considering that when the rocket got back to Earth, 68% of these creatures were alive. Scientists don't put all their hopes only on these water bears. They keep testing if there are some other life forms that could survive on the red planet. They did an experiment called Biomex on the International Space Station. They took tiny organisms such as algae, bacteria, and other similar creatures and kept exposing them to really tough conditions in space for 18 months. This means things like huge changes in temperature, extreme radiation, and vacuum. The amazing part is that many of these tiny life forms survived these harsh conditions and came back to Earth as true space heroes. So they could probably deal with the hardships of living on Mars. Scientists studied archaea as well. Those are tiny, ancient microorganisms that have existed in salty seawater on our planet for more than 3.5 billion years. Some of their relatives from the Arctic also survived in space-like conditions. But life on Mars doesn't have to be a whole new thing. Billions of years ago, the red planet might have been a bit like Earth. It most likely had water, and that's one of the key ingredients for life. Scientists believe tiny organisms called methanogens might have thrived there. They were hiding beneath the surface to stay safe from harsh radiation. These organisms could have breathed in hydrogen and carbon dioxide, exhaling methane gas. But as they gobbled up hydrogen, which was a powerful greenhouse gas back then, they might have cooled the planet too much. So it's possible these ancient microbes are still somewhere there, trapped in ice deep below the surface. They could be in a sort of deep sleep, waiting for better conditions to wake up, or some new cool friends from Earth.
Consider now Enceladus, Saturn's icy moon, one of the most promising places to look for life outside Earth. Scientists have just detected the last one of the 6 necessary ingredients for its formation: phosphorus. This rarest element has been discovered in an ocean on Enceladus. This rare element helps make the soil fertile on Earth. But the concentration of this mineral in the hidden seas on the distant moon might be from 100 to 1,000 times greater than in the oceans of our home planet. It might be because Enceladus' ocean is rich in carbonates, just like soda water, and this soda water is likely to dissolve the phosphates in the moon's rocks. The new discovery also suggests that on other icy moons of Saturn, like Titan, the waters may be loaded with phosphorus too. Why are scientists so excited about this mineral? Well, phosphates, which are compounds that contain phosphorus, are crucial components of life on Earth. DNA, RNA, and cell membranes contain them. But among those 6 elements required for life, which are carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, phosphorus is the least common. In 2004, the Cassini space probe entered the dust from the second outermost ring of Saturn, called the E-ring. It's made up of ice grains in Enceladus ejects. And while studying these ice grains examined by Cassini's cosmic dust analyzer, researchers have detected phosphorus. Enceladus is the 6th largest moon of Saturn. It's not really large, only 314 miles across. This makes the space body small enough to fit inside Arizona. We should try that sometime. Interestingly, when the Cassini space probe first arrived at Saturn, astronomers thought that Enceladus was going to be a frozen ball of ice. But then, surprise, surprise, they spotted plumes of icy particles and water vapor erupting from geysers on the moon's surface. It became clear that there was a global ocean between the moon's rocky core and its icy shell. The same researchers previously discovered that Saturn's moon might be home to complex organic molecules, too. Before, scientists thought phosphates could be trapped within the rocky cores of Enceladus and similar worlds. That's why the newest works, which hint that phosphates might also be abundant in the ocean, came as a surprise. Researchers examined 305 ice grains from Saturn's E-ring and found out that 9 of them contained phosphates. And these results were clear and unmistakable. And it's very important because some time ago, phosphine, a compound of hydrogen and phosphorus, was believed to exist in the clouds of Venus. But no one has managed to find any evidence to support this theory. On Enceladus, there's no controversy, and phosphates do exist there. Astronomers consider Europa one of the most promising places in the solar system to search for new life forms. All because this moon has a huge saltwater ocean with a depth of 40 to 100 miles. Yes, it is hidden under a layer of ice that is estimated to be from 10 to 20 miles thick. But it is still potentially habitable. Astronomers claim that plumes of water erupt from cracks in the ice shell and release the contents of the moon's ocean into space. Of course, it's going to be challenging for any life-seeking mission to access such a deep environment. On the bright side, as we are, scientists already have some evidence that there are way shallower pools that probably lie much closer to the surface of the moon. They might be located even less than 1 mile under the ice. And there are 2 great things about this news. First of all, it boosts the odds of life existing on Europa. And secondly, if it's true, it can make it easier for future missions to find these life forms, if there are any. Then we've got Titan, Saturn's largest moon. It's smaller and has lighter gravity than Earth, but it still reminds us of our planet. Like on Earth, nitrogen dominates its atmosphere. Titan is the only other world in our solar system with lakes and rivers. These water bodies are made of hydrocarbons, methane, and ethane. There's also a subsurface ocean of water, but it's located very deep down, and no one has figured out yet if this ocean makes contact with anything under the surface. If it does, it could provide fuel for life after mixing with complex chemistry on the surface. But Enceladus and the other icy moons aren't the only place in the solar system that might host or once hosted life. In 2003, Mars Express, a spacecraft launched by the European Space Agency, discovered methane in the atmosphere of Mars. On our planet, the biggest part of this gas in the atmosphere is produced by living creatures, for example, by cattle digesting food and emitting, gas. However, scientists think that methane was stable in the Martian atmosphere for about 300 years. And then, in 2006, the methane almost entirely vanished from the red planet. And it happened 600 times faster than the researchers' model accounted for. The question? What or who generated the gas, and where did it go? Another Martian mystery is microbes that might be sleeping beneath the surface of Mars. There, they might have been protected from the harsh radiation coming from space for millions of years. Scientists simulated the conditions on Mars in a lab to check if it could possibly be true. And they were amazed to find out that bacteria could easily survive in such conditions for 280 million years. Ooh, that's a long shelf life. This means that if life existed on Mars, we could find the evidence in the planet's subsurface by drilling into the Martian soil. Right now, there is no flowing water on Mars, and cells or spores would simply dry out. Plus, the frozen temperature is similar to that of dry ice. In other words, it's deeply frozen. Let it go. And still, there could be 6 types of bacteria and fungi living underground on the red planet. The most likely of them is nicknamed Conan the Bacterium due to its tough nature. Well, I guess time will show. Anyway, if we don't find life outside Earth in our solar system, we could probably look for it on exoplanets, which is what planets outside our star system are called. Some of them look very promising. The closest to Earth exoplanet is Proxima Centauri b. It's a mere 4.2 light-years away from Earth. Recently, astronomers have found out that this world might resemble Earth even more than they previously thought. It's just 17% more massive than our home planet. It orbits a star that is dimmer and less massive than the Sun. Proxima Centauri b is in the middle of the star's habitable zone. This means that the chances of liquid water and life might exist on the planet. It looks like the exoplanet is tidally locked with its parent star. One of its sides faces the star at all times, and the other is always in the darkness. Scientists haven't figured out yet whether the planet has an atmosphere, is traveling too close to its star, and completes one orbit within 11 Earth days. The radiation from the star might be pulling the planet's air away. If this is the case, Proxima Centauri b isn't likely to have liquid water on its surface. Gliese 832c is 16.2 light-years away from Earth. In the cosmic scheme of things, it's a stone's throw away. This exoplanet is 5 times as massive as Earth and travels much closer to its parent star. That's why a year on this planet lasts a mere 36 days. But since this star is a red dwarf, much cooler and dimmer than the Sun, Gliese 832c gets as much light and heat as our planet. At the same time, it's still unclear if it's similar to Earth. The planet probably has a much thicker atmosphere that creates a runaway greenhouse effect. This phenomenon occurs when a planet absorbs more heat from its host star than it can release back into space. This means that Gliese 832c is more likely to resemble scorching hot Venus rather than the relatively cool Earth. Hey, I'm cool with that. August 23, 2023, a day when India's Chandrayaan-3 spacecraft made history by becoming the first to touch down on the lunar South Pole, a place we can't normally see from Earth. What makes this lunar hideaway so fascinating to scientists? Well, it turns out it's hiding something precious: lunar ice. This place is believed to be more abundant with this ice than what we found up north. And it's not hard to see why scientists are so buzzed up about it. It's a frozen water source, and it could become our key to building a permanent lunar home, or even fueling missions all the way to Mars. Scientists knew about this ice for over 2 decades, since the NASA spacecraft accidentally stumbled upon it during one of the missions. Then in 2018, NASA triumphantly declared that they're 100% sure about it. They said that the south pole of the moon is abundant with water. Now picture this. Future lunar settlers could tap into this water supply. It could help us sustain life in the barren lunar landscape. Plus, by cleverly splitting the water into oxygen and hydrogen, we could receive both air and rocket fuel. All this will make moon missions more feasible and self-sustaining. It's also a great glimpse into the past. This ice, maybe as old as the moon itself, could unlock the moon's and Earth's deep mysteries. But it turns out that water isn't rare in space at all. There might be lots of planets out there where life could thrive. We know this because we started finding water vapor around stars, and this water is remarkably similar to the water in our own solar system. This discovery suggests that the water on Earth originally came from space. Water forms around stars in the cloud of extremely hot vapor. Then it turns into ice and sticks to tiny dust particles. These particles stick together over time and become bigger objects, like comets, planets, and other things. Some of these become comets and planets in our own solar system. And this is how water is being spread across the universe, and it may be how it got to our planet and the moon too. Scientists think that the lunar ice might have journeyed here eons ago. Maybe it hitched a ride on water-rich asteroids that smacked into the moon's surface. All this has big implications for us. The southern pole is an ideal canvas for humanity to establish a real moon base. Imagine brick domes connected by secret underground tunnels. They'll be bustling with people busily operating computers. Some others will be cruising the lunar landscape in their jeeps or on their way to mine precious resources. We have some pretty cool ideas on how to build this. First, you probably imagine hauling hefty and water-draining shelters all the way from Earth. But maybe there's a more effective way. Think about our history as a civilization. Every time we ventured to a new place, we surveyed the surroundings for available resources and used them to survive and thrive. This is how we spread across our own planet. So why shouldn't we spread across the Moon the same way? Now, you might wonder what resources the Moon might offer. We know about the ice, and it can be turned into water. But we can clearly see that our planet lacks lush greenery and edible food. Well, it might not be obvious, but the Moon does have something to offer: mineral resources and sunlight. Unlike Earth, where the sun rises and sets, the lunar poles offer quite a beautiful sight. The sun gracefully orbits the horizon the entire day, which means it can provide an almost uninterrupted source of power. Imagine living in a world bathed in perpetual sunlight. I'm sure the solar panels will love it. Me? Not so much. Still, we could use not only the sun's light, but also its heat. Honestly, we should just use everything. If we're left with spare metal while producing oxygen, find a purpose for that metal too. We need to treat the environment responsibly, not only on Earth, but on the Moon as well. Which is why scientists are learning how to turn the Moon's most abundant resources, regolith, into sturdy bricks. They've been quite inventive in figuring out how to create moon bricks. Scientists want to use the sun's heat to melt lunar dust, layer by layer, essentially creating a 3D printer for moon dust. Engineers have also cooked up bricks using solar ovens and zapped lunar soil with microwaves. They become quite adept at it. So yeah, perhaps we're going to establish a little brick factory on the Moon and build regolith houses. It's like Minecraft in real life. As soon as you find some cool new material, you gotta build a tiny house with it. If successful, these bricks could be used to construct entire buildings, potentially covering inflatable modules or giving new life to abandoned landers. So, will astronauts need to become skilled bricklayers? Well, they won't do everything themselves. We'd have to create a small automated system involving robots working collaboratively. Humans will, of course, oversee the construction site. Despite all this automation, scientists believe that living on the Moon is going to be, well, call it cozy. The designs may involve stacked living quarters or multi-purpose areas. However, there would be some challenges too. On the Moon, things get extreme. Imagine scorching temperatures that can go up to 212 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, and at night, they plunge down to a chilly minus 290 degrees. And it's not just the weather. The Moon gets relentlessly exposed to solar radiation, cosmic rays, and micrometeorite impacts. All these things gradually wear down anything on its surface. Another big challenge is the lunar dust. On the Moon, there's no air to breathe, and the dust there can cause problems. And this one isn't only regular dust. It's super clingy and can even make astronauts sneeze and have watery eyes, as if they're having a lunar hay fever. It can also damage equipment and spacesuits. It's not something you want to mess with. Scientists have found that the dust is made when meteors hit the Moon, creating tiny particles and sharp glass shards. It's toxic, and its tiny particles can float around in low lunar gravity, making it hard to breathe. Unlike on Earth, the Moon doesn't have wind or rain to clean it away. So now they're studying it to find out how to prevent this annoying problem from ruining their entire mission. There's more to this lunar haven than meets the eye. Scientists also want to delve into the mysteries of low-frequency electromagnetic waves there. These waves are whispers from the far reaches of the universe. These elusive signals have remained hidden from us for ages. We only caught some cacophony of radio and other background noise, but that's it. On the Moon's dark side, however, we can finally record and study them. Studying these waves will help scientists to unlock the secrets of the universe's origins. It's not just about the Earth or the Moon. We're talking about peering back to the very beginnings of our world. our new lunar lab might help us to forever reshape our understanding of the cosmos. So, NASA has some big plans on the Moon now. Their Artemis mission completed a successful return to Earth in December 2022 after nearly a month in space. It ventured far beyond the Moon. This mission proved the capabilities of some of our recent technological developments that will help us explore Mars. The goal of Artemis is to establish a lasting presence on the Moon. They want to create a gateway, like a space station in orbit around the satellite, to help with the landings. Artemis 2 is set to carry astronauts to lunar orbit in 2024, and during Artemis 3, which should take place in the mid-2020s, 2 astronauts will touch down near the Moon's south pole. It's quite possible that the lunar base will be built within the next couple of decades. So, stay tuned.
Soon we might start constructing loads of stuff on the Moon. All because India's moon mission has recently detected sulfur near the Moon's south pole. This chemical element can come in extremely handy for creating infrastructure on our satellite. It's the first time this chemical element has been discovered on Earth's natural satellite. This sought-after element is mostly found near Earth's volcanoes. Its appearance on the Moon speaks volumes about the satellite's volcanic history and its past atmospheric conditions. The mission's rover detected this chemical element less than a week after touching down around 70 degrees from the Moon's south pole on the 23rd of August, 2023. This historic landing on the lunar surface made India the 4th country to safely land a mission on the Moon. It's also the first spacecraft to touch down so close to the south pole of our satellite. It's an area of strategic importance because it's believed to be home to deposits of water ice. If it turns out to be true, future missions might be able to harvest it and turn this water ice into drinking water or even rocket fuel. For 2 weeks, the lander carried out the data collection, mainly focused on the analysis of the Moon's soil and its extremely thin atmosphere. Meanwhile, the solar-powered Pragyan rover started its quest to find frozen water on the Moon. As for the lander, it demonstrated another amazing feat on the 3rd of September. The spacecraft fired up its engines and lifted itself for about 16 inches into the air. Then it made a tiny hop to land 12 to 16 inches away from its original position. It's kinda a big deal. Being able to get a lander back off the surface of the Moon is essentially for future missions, showing that they can safely return soil samples or even astronauts back home after a lunar mission. In September, the Indian spacecraft was put into sleeping mode. The 14-day-long lunar night was approaching, and the spacecraft wasn't designed to collect scientific data during this period of time. So far, we've learned about a few major findings of the mission. One is related to measuring the temperature of the Moon's topsoil at different depths. Intriguingly, the surface of the satellite in that region turned out to be hotter than expected. It was believed that the temperature could be between 68 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface, but it was around 158 degrees Fahrenheit, way hotter than it should be. The other discovery indicates the presence of several chemical elements, including oxygen. Besides, the data received from the spacecraft confirms the presence of aluminum, calcium, iron, titanium, silicon, and other chemical elements on the lunar surface close to the South Pole. The rover also used special instruments designed to measure quakes and rumbles beneath the lunar surface to detect some seismic activity. It brings us back to the sulfur detected thanks to the rover's spectroscope. Scientists are currently working on figuring out whether this element formed on the surface in a natural way or whether it's the result of volcanic activity or a meteor strike. Another astonishing thing found on the Moon is a rock, and it may be the oldest known Earth rock. A 0.7-inch wide chip included in a large rock collection brought to our planet by Apollo astronauts might actually be a 4-billion-year-old fragment of Earth. This finding could help us paint a better picture of the intense pounding early Earth got at the dawn of its life. It could go like this. Soon after the rock formed, an asteroid impact might have blasted it from Earth. At that time, our planet's satellite was 3 times closer to Earth than it is today. The collision was so powerful that this chunk of terrestrial rock found its way to the moon. Later, this fragment got engulfed in a lunar breccia, a motley kind of rock. Eventually, the rock was brought back home to Earth by Apollo 14 astronauts. Even though scientists had found meteorites coming from Mars and the moon before, it was the first time a rock from the moon turned out to be a terrestrial meteorite. They also found out that the rock had formed in a water-rich environment at temperatures and pressures corresponding to those at around 12 miles beneath the surface of our planet. In 2019, China's Chang'e 4 mission made history by landing on the far side of the moon. The mission's rover helped researchers visualize structures hidden deep below the surface of the satellite, revealing billions of years of lunar history. The Yutu-2 rover made this discovery with the help of its lunar-penetrating radar. It imaged deep into the moon's surface and listened to echoes of sound bouncing back off structures hidden from view under the surface of the moon. It turned out those structures were resting at depths of almost 1,000 feet. The research suggests that the first 130 feet under the surface are made up of layers of dust, soil, and rocks. The instruments also discovered a concealed crater that must have formed after a large object slammed into the moon's surface. Long, long ago, ancient lava was likely to be flowing deep underground. Researchers believe that the broken rocks around the formation might be debris produced by the impact. They also found that the volcanic rock layers were thinner the closer they were to the surface. Such a thickness variation of lava flows might mean a decrease in the number and magnitude of eruptions over time. So, lunar volcanic activity gradually dwindled since the moon's formation around 4.5 billion years ago. On the far side of the moon, there is one of the largest and oldest impact craters in our solar system, the South Pole Aitken Basin. Unfortunately, from Earth, you can only see its outer rim, which looks like a huge chain of mountains. It's a ginormous 8-mile deep dent, stretching for more than 1,500 miles in diameter and covering 1/4 of the moon's surface. Astronomers are sure that this crater appeared when an asteroid collided with the moon around 4 billion years ago. And now, look at this gigantic chunk of metal the size of 4 states of Connecticut. As for its weight in pounds, it's enough to say that the number contains 18 zeros. This mysterious mass is hidden about 180 miles under the moon's surface, somewhere in the middle of the South Pole Aitken Basin. It was discovered when GRAIL, which stands for NASA's Gravity Recovery and Interior Laboratory Mission, gathered data about our natural satellite. When examining this information, scientists noticed that in one place on the moon's surface, there was a weird change in gravity. After researching this phenomenon, they concluded that something mysterious was weighing down the basin floor there. So far, researchers haven't figured out the origin of the bizarre lump, but there are several theories. One of them claims that the finding is a chunk of dense oxide, which appeared when the moon was just taking its shape. At that time, the satellite was still covered with ancient oceans of magma, and the lump could be formed at the final stages of its cooling. However, most scientists support another theory, according to which the puzzling mass is part of the giant asteroid that once created the South Pole Aitken Basin. Since the thing is metallic, it's probably the iron-nickel core of the asteroid. There might be a labyrinth of lava tubes on the moon. Not so long ago, astronomers received the results of underground topography and discovered a massive cave under the surface of Earth's satellite. It could be the result of the lunar volcanic activity that happened more than 3 billion years ago. Streams of lava hardened, creating a thick, hard crust on the outside. But inside, it kept flowing, melting the rock and creating tunnels and caves. Numerous small pits in the moon's surface discovered by NASA seem to be the openings to such lava tubes. If this theory is confirmed, the underground tunnels might serve not only as a convenient location for human-crewed space missions, but also as much-needed water sources for astronauts.
Neil Armstrong had been getting ready for his mission on the moon for over 3 years. To resist microgravity conditions, he had to learn how to walk sideways by being strapped and suspended at an angle in trying to walk along walls. His limits were tested through an intense diet and sleep regimen, since in space he would only have beef and vegetables, previously dehydrated and stuffed into a package. Back in the day, astronauts had to experience the desert, jungle, open sea, and Arctic survival training. These days it's a lot more structured. But back then, it was more of a let's drop this person in the middle of nowhere with no supplies and see if they make it. Before landing on the moon, he had to gather and study rock samples in the Grand Canyon, explore ancient volcano formations in the Nevada National Security Site, and look into gas and lava vents, lava lakes, and pit craters in various locations in Hawaii. On July 20th, 1969, Armstrong was given a hearty breakfast before blastoff. Steak, eggs, toast, juice, and coffee. He received what doctors call a low-residue meal, which means he wouldn't have to go to the bathroom soon after. It took him 109 hours and 42 minutes to reach the surface of the moon, in an area called the Sea of Tranquility. He had to travel 240,000 miles to get there. The crew could have gone for the Ocean of Storms or the Central Bay, but this place was chosen for landing because it had good visibility, was relatively smooth, and was easily reachable with as little propellant as possible. When he was at about 500 feet above the surface of the moon, Armstrong had to maneuver the spacecraft manually to make sure they wouldn't land in a dangerous crater. He continued to hover for about a minute and a half, moving it sideways until he felt comfortable to land. As soon as his device landed safely, he immediately radioed to Mission Control, located in Houston, Texas. The now famous message,
"The Eagle has landed."
Steadily, he went down the lunar module's ladder, while a television camera was attached to the craft to record his progress. The camera also transmitted the signal back to Earth, where hundreds of millions of people were anxiously waiting. At precisely 10:56 p.m. EDT on the same day, Armstrong placed his feet onto the lunar soil, saying,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
The schedule said that the astronaut needed to sleep before the first moonwalk, but he chose to go outside earlier than planned, since he obviously couldn't sleep. If Armstrong had walked on the moon without special equipment to breathe, he would have smelled a weird odor, sort of musty and sulfuric. Still, he had the chance to smell it when he returned to the lunar module. The thing is, the dirt had clung to his feet, so the odor spread all over the cabin. He described it as wet fireplace ashes, or how the air smells after fireworks shows. Who would have thought you needed to pack a scented candle when going to the moon? Apart from the people that have since made it to the moon, no one ever got the chance to know precisely what the crew was smelling. Even during that first mission, when moon soil and rock samples were transported to labs in airtight containers, once they were opened back on Earth, surprisingly, the smell was gone. He also felt the surface of the moon to be fine and powdery, but said he had no difficulty in moving around. One other member of his crew joined him about 20 minutes later. The whole moonwalk took a little over 2 hours. During this time, Armstrong and his teammates set up various devices on the surface of our satellite. One was meant to precisely measure the exact distance from there to Earth, by timing how long it took for a laser beam to travel from Earth to the lunar surface and back. Another meant to measure moonquakes and potential meteor impacts. which leads us to the discovery that the moon was pretty alive after all. We know today that the largest moonquakes are much weaker than the largest earthquakes, though their movements can last for up to an hour, way longer than on Earth. They managed to gather somewhere around 50 pounds of rock in soil samples. They also snapped many photographs of the terrain, where they also planted a US flag. The astronaut even got the chance to catch up with President Richard Nixon, for less than a minute though. The final thing on the list for Armstrong was to go for a walk to what is now known as East Crater, 65 yards east of the lunar module. It was the greatest distance traveled from the spacecraft on that specific mission, approximately the length of half a football field. As soon as his tasks were done, Armstrong went back into the lunar module and safely closed the hatch to get some sleep. While preparing for liftoff, Armstrong and his crew discovered that, because of their chunky spacesuits, they managed to break the ignition switch for the ascent engine. No big deal, they thought. So they used a part of a pen to push in the circuit breaker to start the launch sequence. At 1:54 p.m., the famous Eagle began to ascend. Apart from the scientific equipment installed on the surface of the moon, a plaque was also left there. It read, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." Years later, Armstrong said that NASA limited their time on the moon because they didn't know how the spacesuits would handle the moon's extreme temperatures, as high as 260 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, to as low as 280 degrees Fahrenheit below zero at night. Things got a bit more complicated when Armstrong landed back on Earth, since he had been exposed to unknown space particles. The result? He and his team had to be placed in planetary protection quarantine on their return, as soon as their space capsule safely splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th. That specific quarantine for the Apollo 11 astronauts is one of the reasons why we have microwaves in our kitchens today. When they first returned from the moon, they initially spent their first few days in a mobile quarantine facility, or MQF. Sure, the MQF featured comfortable chairs, bunks, a toilet, and showers, but it didn't leave a lot of space for fancy cooking. Since there was no room for a standard oven or grill, and to also reduce the potential fires that might have occurred, NASA had to get creative. That's how the original countertop microwave oven was developed, to easily help astronauts get their meals without the hustle of a fully equipped kitchen. These days you can see that first microwave in a museum in Oakland, California. After returning to Earth, Armstrong claimed he would never reach for the stars again. But he didn't stop exploring though. Back in 1985, he joined a professional team of other greatest explorers to the North Pole. He was joined by mountaineer Edmund Hillary, aviator Steve Fawcett, and photographer Patrick Morrow, reaching the pole on April 6, 1985. Armstrong claimed he wanted to see what the Earth's icy pole looked like from the ground, since he had only seen it from the surface of the moon. The Apollo 11 mission was nevertheless unforgettable for Armstrong since. In 2015, the Smithsonian Institution uncovered that he had kept hidden a cloth bag full of small parts from the lunar module. It included his waist tether, some utility lights, and their brackets, an emergency wrench, and the optical sight that was mounted above Armstrong's window of the space module. It also contained the data acquisition camera that recorded the iconic footage of Armstrong taking his small step on the moon. Armstrong kept it to himself for many years until his widow, Carol, eventually found it. He even kept it a secret from his official biographer, who at many times asked if he had kept any memorabilia from his famous mission. He didn't sneak those objects back on Earth, though. He just mentioned it to be a bunch of trash he wanted to bring back.
It's been decades since the last manned moon landing, Apollo 17, which happened in December 1972. Isn't it time we thought about going back to our dusty satellite and maybe even staying there? NASA has made a promise on this subject. They're preparing to send astronauts on the moon again, perhaps by 2025. This will all happen through a program called Artemis. It's also going to include the first woman ever to experience the lunar surface. Now you might ask, why haven't we done this already? One former NASA administrator said something interesting on the subject. It's not because of scientific or technological issues. Problem was that the potential projects took too long and were just too costly. You see, space travel, especially when it involves humans, isn't easy on the pockets. It's true that, in recent years, NASA had budgets of billions of dollars. Sure sounds like enough money, right? Well, not when you check out their to-do list. That's because they have to consider everything. From telescopes and giant rocket projects to missions also targeting the Sun, Jupiter, Mars, and beyond. When you look at it this way, NASA needs to be very good at budgeting to achieve all those goals. It's not just because of finances, though. The moon itself is quite problematic. It poses real dangers that cannot be taken lightly. For starters, its surface is filled with craters and boulders that aren't easy to land on. Then, there is the moon dust, or regolith, if you'd like to call it by its scientific name. It was created over many years by meteorite impacts. It's extremely harsh and sticks to everything. It can potentially damage spacesuits, vehicles, and systems quite quickly. Also, dealing with the lunar habitat isn't a walk in the park either. The moon has no protective atmosphere. What this means is that for 14 days at a time, the lunar surface is faced with harsh rays from the sun. That period is followed by another 2 weeks of total darkness. All these changes create extreme temperatures, which us humans are not really accustomed to. There are solutions, don't worry. NASA is working on dust and sun-resistant spacesuits and vehicles. They're even developing a system that might supply electricity during those lunar nights. What's even more interesting about this system is it could come in handy on Mars too, once we get there. NASA also needs to draw in really smart people for its projects. Think about it. The average age of the people working for the mission control for Apollo 13 was just 26 years old. And these people had already been part of numerous missions by that time, which means they'd had considerable experience from a very young age. But here's where other individuals can help too. In recent years, it wasn't just NASA who's been working tirelessly to revolutionize space travel. There are many successful people out there with enough resources to join in on these efforts. Some are developing new types of rockets that can land on the moon too. In total, NASA landed 12 people on our satellite. It's definitely one of the most awesome moments in its history, if not the best. And those astronauts did amazing things up there. They brought back rocks, took snapshots, did science experiments, and even left flags behind. These were all important moments of the Apollo missions. But they weren't meant to create a safe place for humans on the moon. Scientists have had this idea of a lunar space station for a long time now. It's only logical. After all, it's just a 3-day trip from Earth. It means we can, technically, afford to make little mistakes here and there, without messing up the whole project. Plus, we'd learn so much before venturing even further into space. A moon base could provide fuel for deep space missions. We could also build telescopes up there and launch them way easier in space. It could also help us in another important project. Figure out how to make Mars habitable too. Not to mention, a lunar space station would help us learn more about the moon's origin. Who knows, it could even bring in some money because of all that fun, exciting lunar tourism. Either way, the Apollo moon program took a lot of work. For starters, let's look at the sheer number of people involved. Around 400,000, from every corner of the states. Not everything was picture perfect, tough. There were two main unfortunate events. Firstly, a fire mishap at the launch pad of Apollo 1. Secondly, an oxygen tank decided to throw a tantrum on Apollo 13, causing severe issues mid-mission. An important part of the project was Saturn V. It is to this day the most powerful rocket flown successfully, being 36 stories high. Still finding it hard to picture? This rocket stood twice as tall as Niagara Falls. Thanks to Saturn V, NASA successfully completed 13 missions. This included chauffeuring 24 astronauts towards the moon, with half of them even having a little walk on its surface. The existing rockets and space shuttles can't go beyond low Earth orbit. In simpler terms, they can't reach the moon with all the gadgets astronauts need to thrive. Current space vehicles are just not capable of carrying that load, at least not since the Apollo missions happened. Regardless, we did make a lot of progress on Earth and are ready to send astronauts to our satellite pretty soon. Here's where the Artemis project comes in. It's a program overseen by NASA. And to make sure it all goes well, NASA previously launched Orion, a spacecraft with no crew on board to orbit the moon and return to Earth. Think of it as an automated test drive. Before we actually send people out there again, we need to make sure all the devices work properly. One day, Orion will be the vehicle that will take astronauts to the moon again. It features a launch abort system to keep astronauts safe in case something bad happens during launch. It also has a service module, which is the powerhouse that fuels and propels Orion and keeps astronauts alive with water, oxygen, power, and temperature control. All these future projects make one wonder, what will life on the moon be like anyway? We can only use our imagination for now. Some say we'll be living in homes straight out of a fairy tale, something like a cozy hobbit hole. Living underground on the moon might be a must. That's due to the scorching temperatures and the lack of oxygen. If you add meteorite threats and the non-stop radiation, it's no wonder we can't just walk on its surface. What about transportation? Big and small companies alike are trying to create the ideal moon ride. If current estimations are current, one type of moon taxi will take off as soon as 2024. Unlike our current rockets, these space taxis won't have to deal with the harsh conditions of re-entering Earth's atmosphere. It will be easier for them to make multiple round trips. To support our lunar living, we'll need to have a special area for space taxis to safely take off and land. Think of it as a landing pad on a firm, flat stretch of moon surface, protected by walls to shield against moon dust. Moving around on the moon's surface will be made easier too. The next generation vehicles we're talking about will have their own controlled environment, which means you won't need a spacesuit while inside. Should feel like stepping out of your space ride for a bit. Then of course, you'll need to put on your spacesuit. All right. So we've got our homes and our rides sorted. But what about fuel? That's where the moon throws us a lifeline. The moon's lighter gravity means we don't need as much power to escape its pull. Plus, the moon has ice, and that's super handy. We might be able to convert this ice into rocket fuel. We'll need dedicated space gadgets to help gather this ice. One such tool is called Trident. It's like a drill, perfect for digging into the icy moon surface. Additional robotic helpers would then turn this ice into fuel and deliver it to a space gas station. If this works, rockets on their way to Mars could stop by for a quick fuel top-up before continuing their journey.
About 8 billion inhabitants of planet Earth found out the same terrible news in one day. Someone saw it on TV. Others heard it on the phone while scrolling through social media or listening to music. Some witnessed this news in a dream while sleeping. Someone's voice said it in all languages to ensure everyone understood it. I have good news and bad news for you. Let's start with the bad news. You're all characters in YouTube videos in which your planet gets into a situation where the moon breaks in half. For the audience, it will be a hypothetical story, but for you, these events will become a reality. The good news is that I was joking. There is no good news. But don't worry, the apocalypse won't start on your planet. Maybe just a little bit. Have a nice day. At first, the entire population panics. Then, a few days later, everyone calms down. Maybe it was a mass hallucination, and the moon will be all right. But at this moment, scientists have discovered the danger. A colossal meteorite is flying towards us from the distant depths of space. This meteorite is super fast and pretty flat, but has sharp edges. Fortunately, it will miss the Earth by a few thousand miles, but the moon won't be that lucky. The meteorite flies through our Earth's only natural satellite directly in the middle. So it passes through the moon, sweeps past our planet, and flies away into distant space. At this moment, all people can't take their eyes off the moon. The meteorite cuts it perfectly in half, gently, clearly, painlessly. So, what shall we do now? Will the Earth survive this? Our satellite breaks into 2 equal parts, but fortunately, they don't fly away from each other. The moon's great gravity attracts them back like a magnet. Scientists are sure that the parts will connect in a couple of billion years, and the moon will become the same as it used to be. But the coolest thing is that people won't feel any changes. Everyone around the world will celebrate this good news. The voice was wrong. But then, another problem appears. A massive meteorite in the form of a shoe is flying from the deepest space to us. It enters our solar system and approaches the Earth at high speed. The space boot crashes into one half of the moon and then flies away. Now, the moon is definitely breaking into 2 parts. The first half remains in the same place. The second one is flying towards us. A small meteor shower begins on Earth because of the falling moon fragments, but it's not so bad. Most of these rocks are burning up in the atmosphere. But almost the entire split-off half is falling apart around the orbit of our planet. It forms a stone belt. Now the Earth is like Saturn. Rotating fragments destroy part of our artificial satellites. Communication and the internet work inconsistently. It takes people a couple of years to restore a stable connection. The International Space Station no longer exists. Luckily, all the astronauts managed to return to Earth before half the moon got to them. So, moon rocks are flying around the planet, and people see half the moon in the sky. Life doesn't change much for the first few days, but those who live on the coast of the seas and oceans notice the consequences. The moon used to influence the tides. It was flying around the Earth and made oceans take an oval shape. There were tides on the side where the moon was closer. There were ebbs on the opposite side. But now, this schedule is wrong. Half of the moon attracts less water. Yes, the moon lost half its weight and began approaching the Earth. But its gravitational force has become weaker. Seabirds, many species of fish, sea turtles, and other coastal animals may not survive these changes. Their natural instincts associated with the moon help them determine the time for getting food, breeding, and flying south. For example, tiny turtles expect a strong tide in the morning. They run to the water, but the water doesn't reach them. Turtles can't hide in the ocean in time and become dinner for seagulls. Crabs can't lay eggs because the tide has started earlier than usual. Wolves go mad in the woods. They howl loudly every night and can't stop. The whole natural world can't understand what's going on. The human body is also feeling some discomfort. Many people have low and high blood pressure, and some experience severe headaches. Half of the moon changes the entire ecosystem of the planet. Adapting to new conditions will take several tens, maybe hundreds of years. A couple of weeks pass, and people notice the days are now shorter. The moon always slowed the Earth's rotation and made one day last 24 hours. The Earth is spinning faster now. The night and the morning come earlier than everyone is used to. Earth rotation speed has increased and reduced the number of hours per day to 15. People suffer from insomnia or oversleeping. The body needs time to get used to it. Work schedules are changing all over the world. Previously, people came to the office at 9 and left at 6. Now, they arrive at 7 and leave at 2 p.m. Sleep time got shorter, and people are really sad because of this. Progress slows down because the short working time. The technologies of the future are now 20 to 30 years late. Hourly pay remains the same, so bosses now pay less for fewer working hours. The whole moon stabilized the weather and climate on the planet. Look at Mars. It has 2 small moons. They quickly spin around it and rock Mars around on its axis. As a result, strong winds, sandstorms, and thunderstorms often happen on the red planet. Now the half of the moon that approached us takes the Earth out of stable rotation. This changes the seasonal temperatures in the world. It even gets hotter in hot places. And snowstorms are raging in cold regions. There are short, massive downpours instead of sunny weather. A typical breeze can grow into a hurricane and small waves into a tsunami. The seasons are changing faster now. Winters are colder and summers are hotter. Changing the rotation of the planet affects the Earth's magnetic field. Since the compass and navigation systems are unstable now, we need to recalculate where the north and south are. Birds can't fly south to wait out the winter since they don't know what direction to fly. Their inner compass is broken. Several hundred years have passed. People are entirely accustomed to the new conditions on Earth. New species of animals and fish have appeared. Birds can navigate the sky by the moon again. The planet's economy has been restored. Hourly wages have become higher. People now get enough sleep from 5 to 6 hours a day and work for 4 to 5 hours. The reduction of day and night has also affected the entertainment industry. Movies now last 1 hour. One episode of some TV series lasts 30 minutes. Life goes faster. An average person now lives to be 96 years old. In fact, the passage of time hasn't changed at all. Its calculus did. Several thousand years have passed. People look different now. Now they have big eyes that absorb more light. Half of the moon doesn't shine as bright as the whole thing, so the nights have become darker. It took the human eye a couple of thousand years to develop the ability to see clearly in this new dark. Animals need to navigate better in these conditions, so their eyes have become larger and more sensitive. During all this time, people have cleared the orbit of moon rocks. Several space stations fly around our planet. And again, people hear this strange voice that once told them that they were all characters in one hypothetical YouTube video. This time, the voice says, "Your story ends because the video ends. I'm sorry. Good night."
Hey, ever wanted to taste a salad from space? Well, you might be able to one day. Scientists have taken soil from the moon and successfully grown plants in it. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, it was the first time in our history we set foot on a surface that wasn't Earth. During the several trips to the moon in the Apollo program, astronomers brought back some rocks and soil to study. The researchers named the lunar soil regolith and used the seeds of a particular plant called blah 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 blah, you can read it here, which is found in Asia, Europe, and parts of Africa. They crossed their fingers, not knowing what would happen. The only thing they did know was that the lunar soil was too poor in nutrients to sustain any plants. So they created a lunar soil stimulant made from volcanic ash to replace the real lunar soil and went to work. Since they needed 2 separate experiments, they planted the seeds in Earth soil. It was a controlled experiment. They also planted some seeds in the lunar soil as the variable. They were very careful and used a single gram of lunar soil for the experiment. To their surprise, it only took 2 days to see little green leaves and 6 days for them to be properly visible. But sadly, after day 6, the lunar soil plants stopped growing. The soil wasn't enough to provide the needed nutrients for the plant to thrive. The seeds in the soil from Earth, however, grew lavishly. But not all was lost. Even though the lunar plants didn't continue growing, they survived and were harvested 20 days later. Sadly, they still didn't produce a yummy space salad. The scientists then studied the biological form of the plants and found out that the lunar plants were developing under a lot of stress, as if they were growing in a harsh environment, compared to their counterparts in the regular Earth soil. Either way, the study was a huge success. It was the first step in growing food in the soil that wasn't from Earth. NASA planned on a new moon landing in 2024, but due to some complications, it was pushed back to 2026. This will be the first time a person sets foot on the moon since Apollo 17 in 1972. The next moon landing mission will allow us to collect more lunar soil samples to experiment with other crops and see which ones can live longer. Lunar soil in its natural state is far from the quality soil we have on Earth, but we might find a way to reduce the stress plants growing in it have to endure. Perhaps it'll let plants develop in similar conditions they would have in a proper natural setting. There might be other materials on the moon that can help plants grow healthy. The mission will be under the Artemis program. Elon Musk's SpaceX has been commissioned to build the lunar landing vehicle. At first, they will launch a test flight lasting about 3 weeks and then send astronauts to land at the moon's south pole. Because that section is untouched by sunlight, scientists believe there might be water ice craters there that can be used to make rocket fuel. It would lower the cost of future moon expeditions, since fuel wouldn't have to be imported from Earth. Besides potentially growing plants in lunar soil, using water ice from the craters as fuel would be another way of making the moon self-sufficient for space exploration. Now, Mars would be one of the most difficult places to migrate to when you consider how Earth sustains life. But scientists believe that with the right engineering and living conditions, Mars can potentially become our new home. The red planet has a very similar force of gravity to that on Earth, which means that constructing buildings with proper infrastructure wouldn't be much of a problem. Our biological clocks wouldn't be too affected either, since a day on Mars is roughly 40 minutes longer than on Earth. Elon Musk plans on sending out robots to test the conditions on Mars before humans set foot there. These robots will be humanoids, mimicking the way people walk and move. They must be built in a special way to test how the conditions on Mars would affect us physiologically. These robots can also start constructing buildings for people to live and work in. We would have to be tremendously advanced in our agricultural innovations to grow crops in hostile environments. Despite being called the red planet, Mars is actually chilly, so we'd have to build giant dome-like structures to house a human population. They'd need to be self-sufficient enough not to have to rely on Earth's natural resources. These domes would protect us from harsh sandstorms and sub-temperatures. Now, a mission to Mars might not happen in our lifetime, but at the moment, we can take the first steps. Since we've found out that we can use lunar soil to grow something, the next step is to understand more about the process. We won't be living on the moon anytime soon, so we can use the studies of lunar soil to help us solve some problems on Earth. Countries like India are adapting smart farming that uses robots to speed up the process. Some robots are designed for seeding, harvesting, watering, and other tasks. Robotic manufacturers are in high demand now. They produce unique machines like self-automated tractors and aerial vehicles that can hover over fields and water crops. This form of farming will increase productivity and reduce overall costs. It will also help save water by studying the exact volume crops need. A cool, innovative way of farming is vertical farming, which can be done in heavily populated cities. You can practically use any abandoned warehouse or building to do it. It recycles water used at the top of a vertical farm. It drips to lower levels and is then used again. The farmers stack plants in vertical beds for the water to drip easily. They also use both natural and artificial light. These farms are usually soil-free. Instead, plant roots remain in a nutrient-rich solution that is constantly monitored. This method is cost-efficient and supplies plants with the exact amount of nutrients they need. Other vertical farms use ponds with fish living at the bottom. These fish produce waste that is very rich in nutrients. Plants can use it as food. Vertical farms are growing more popular and may soon replace traditional farming. Vertical farming will allow farmers to grow almost 10 times the amount of produce than a plain field, all because they utilize the space above and below. You don't have to worry about little critters on the ground stealing your crops. You should only worry about flying ones. Indoor farming is becoming very popular. Crops growing outdoors always face natural hazards that can damage them. But with indoor farming, we won't have to rely on seasons to grow certain crops. Indoor farms can replicate the conditions of all climates, and we can have any fruit or veggie at any season. There's also genome altering to make every crop the best of the best. It will eliminate any bad seeds, literally. We won't have to waste tons of crops that aren't suitable for consumption. They can have extra nutrients and be healthier. All of these methods are just the first few steps before we begin with space agriculture on planets with hostile environments. Growing plants in space isn't something new. The International Space Station has an array of specialized gardens for growing veggies. Scientists are studying growing crops and plants in zero gravity, which can provide fresh food for astronauts. They use LED lights above plants to accelerate their growth and install proper watering mechanisms. This might be useful for a handful of astronauts at the International Space Station. But what if we were traveling across the galaxy to populate new planets? Well, we'd have to consider a large space dedicated to indoor farming. On the other hand, technology is likely to improve so much by then that we won't even need veggies and fruits in our daily diet. There might be other yummy alternative stuff to munch on. But hey, I'd rather have that space salad, please. Do you have any croutons? Have you ever seen the other side of the moon? I caught you. Of course not. But maybe you've seen it in photos. In that case, have you ever wondered why the two sides look so different? Well, let me tell you. We can't see the other side of the moon. People believe this is because the moon doesn't rotate around its axis. But this is not true. The moon does rotate. It just does it at the same rate as its orbital motion. This is a particular case of tidal locking called synchronous rotation. The first time we ever saw a far side was only in 1959, all thanks to the Soviet Luna missions and later the US Apollo program. Now, when Luna 3 and other spacecraft transmitted the first far-side images, they revealed a far more cratered hemisphere that looked more like Mercury or Jupiter's moon Callisto. It looked completely different from what we were used to, and that's when we learned how meh the other side is. No, seriously, just look at it. The near side can boast its thinner and smoother crust. These beautiful dark splotches are called lunar mare, the last remnants of ancient lava flows. And when I say ancient, I mean it. They're more than 3 billion years old. Meanwhile, the far side crust is thicker and crater-pocked. The lava flows had almost no effect on these impact craters. It's also devoid of any large-scale mare. Low-key looks like dried white cheese. To be honest, don't you agree that the nearby side is much more beautiful? Write your thoughts in the comments. So, only 50 years ago, we learned something about the apparent differences. But then the scientists discovered something weird. Both sides are different, even in the geochemical composition. And not only in this, our side was thinner than the far side by several miles. But where did such significant differences come from on an ordinary floating stone ball? For scientists, this was a mystery. They started coming up with a lot of theories. The melted moon theory was the main one for a while. It said that it was the Earth's fault that our moon looks like this. This happened several billion years ago. The moon was born because of a collision. One day, an object about the size of Mars crashed into the Earth. At that moment, a piece broke off from it, which later became the moon. However, this piece was somewhere 15 times closer to Earth than it is now. Some scientists created pictures of the so-called early moon. Unlike our cute little white ball, the early moon was a strange-looking, boiling scarlet ball. That piece didn't leave us after the separation. It became tidally locked very soon after. The Earth after the collision was still an incandescent nightmare, full of fire and lava. It was boiling at a temperature of 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And since the moon has always been turned toward us with one side, this side has melted down a little. This would explain why the moon's surface, the so-called mantle, is thinner on the near side than on the far side. During the boiling of the Earth, certain elements evaporated from it. They then settled on the moon. This would explain the difference in geochemical composition between the two sides. But there was a plot hole in this theory. If that's what happened, then where did rare foreign chemical elements come from, such as unusual isotopes of phosphorus, potassium, or tungsten? The nearby site is full of them, and they couldn't have come from the Earth. There were also other theories. Another one said that initially we had two teeny tiny moons. Later they merged into a big one, hence the difference in their composition. But this theory sounds a bit crazy, and it has a plot hole too. For example, the transition between the two sides is way too soft. If our moon was actually two tiny moons, this transition would be more abrupt. So scientists were kind of at a loss on this one. But recently, they finally figured out what really happened to the moon, all thanks to NASA's Grail orbiters. They spent over a year whizzing around the moon, mapping it out, and studying its composition. Using this data, scientists have created around 360 computer simulations. They contain different impacting objects of many sizes traveling at different speeds. Scientists were comparing the results with our current moon. They tried to determine which result was the closest to what we have today. And so, they finally solved this 50-year-old mystery. The answer lies in a collision with a dwarf planet. This collision occurred 4.3 billion years ago. This huge object was slightly larger than Ceres. For those who don't know, Ceres is one of the dwarf planets of our solar system. Its diameter is 580 miles. You could say that one France or one Germany would fit into it. So, this giant object crashed into the moon, somewhere near the South Pole. This collision was so strong that it changed the image of the moon forever. It left a trail of 3,500 miles behind. It would take you 14 hours by plane to fly that distance. This crater covered the entire near side of the moon. It caused damage to the moon's mantle. It also created a so-called South Pole Aitken Base, or SPA basin. This is an impact crater and has a diameter of 1,600 miles, which is like adding one UK plus one Germany. It's important though. The formation of this basin was a defining event in the history of the moon, and it's the second largest impact crater in the solar system. The collision also caused a powerful hot wave to spread across the moon. This wave scattered over the remnants of those rare warm minerals scientists found on the nearby side. That's how our beautiful side became home to something called Procellarum creep terrain, or PKT for short. This is basically a compositional anomaly, a concentration of potassium, phosphorus, and other rare elements like thorium. You can say that those minerals are a gift to us from deep space. Anyway, there were many, and I mean many, collisions in the moon's history. All of them only deepened this already large crater. That's why the mantle on the near side was getting thinner and thinner with the years. Also, our gifted minerals gave off a lot of heat, so the mantle has melted a little bit more and more. Oops, this accidentally caused the moon's volcanoes to wake up. Volcanic activity has increased on the near side. Intense lava flows filled the old empty craters. Ta-da! And this is how the beautiful lunar mare was born. That's about how it all happened. All this information was found thanks to the researchers from Brown, Purdue, Stanford Universities, and NASA's JPL. The research was published by the Journal of Geophysical Research, Planets, so you can read about it in more detail if you're interested. There are still many things we need to learn about the moon. The highest priority is the return mission from the South Pole, the Aitken Basin. Samples brought from there will be used to determine the age of the moon, its history, and the nature of the crust and mantle more accurately. Another critical target is the Moscoviense. This is the name of a large lava plain on the far side of the moon. Studying it will help us better understand the difference between the two sides, as well as tell us how the other side was formed. All this knowledge is significant for understanding the history of the moon, but it's also handy for space exploration in general. Scientists use the moon as a reference point to determine the age of other planets and entire worlds in space. The moon helps us determine the chronology of the life of the whole solar system. So stay tuned for new exciting research and discoveries.
How about playing golf? Not on Earth, but on the moon. Let's journey back to a time 50 years ago when one astronaut turned the lunar surface into the most unusual golf course ever. Any golfer will tell you how tricky it is to avoid sand traps, but picture Alan Shepard, a NASA astronaut dealing with an entire surface that feels like super fine powder. During the Apollo 14 mission, he took a break to showcase some spacey golf skills for everyone watching from Earth. After his first shot, he excitedly made another. For him, it seemed the ball went forever and ever. Let's dial back to reality for a moment. Thanks to the research by the United States Golf Association, or USGA, we've got some numbers. They found that Allen's first moon ball traveled 24 yards, and his second stretched for 40 yards. Now, how does that compare to the average golf shots back here? In regular gravity, one usually swings to about 216 yards. Just goes to show, while we've upgraded our golf game on Earth with tech and training, the moon's low-gravity playground is a different environment altogether. Now, let's give Allen some props. Moon golf? Not as simple as you might think. His club wasn't one from your local sports store. It was a makeshift one. A moon sample collector with a club head stuck to it. Add to that the bulky spacesuit he had on. Imagine trying to swing wearing an outfit that's as stiff as cardboard. With all that gear, Allen could only muster a one-handed swing. Care to have a similar experience? Well, you might not be able to play golf on the moon anytime soon, but you can give it a shot underwater. Some say the conditions are similar. Here's where it gets even more interesting. The USGA didn't just take Allen's word on where the balls landed. They wanted to investigate. For starters, they used ultra-clear footage of the Apollo 14 mission. They also used some sharp images from NASA's special moon camera, launched in 2009. Using this imagery, they mapped out the journey of those two golf balls. Allen loved his unique golf club so much, he wanted to bring it back home. No big deal, right? Well, you see, in those days, astronauts would leave behind unnecessary items to make space for moon rocks. But not this club. So during the 70s, this interstellar golf club found a new home at the USGA Museum in New Jersey. Unlike regular golf clubs, this one had a twist. It was crafted from aluminum and Teflon. It was built to fold and fit snugly within the tight spaces of the lunar lander. How did this whole moon golf idea even pop up? Well, in 1970, golf legend Bob Hope paid a visit to NASA. Inspired by Hope's love for golf, an idea came into Shepard's head: moon golf. To turn his dream into reality, he collaborated with a golf professional and NASA's tech specialists. Together, they crafted a club that met NASA's strict safety norms. But hey, Allen didn't want this to be just a surprise stunt. Remember, traveling to the moon required very strict protocols. They couldn't just randomly have a picnic up there, you know? So, Allen made sure NASA officials agreed with this impromptu game of golf. They were initially skeptical, but eventually gave the green light after Allen passionately laid out his plan. He also promised he'd start playing if everything went smoothly on the mission. Determined to make it perfect, Allen prepped like a champ. The story goes that he'd put on his hefty spacesuit and sneak off to secret spots so he could practice. Decades later, he'd still be reflecting on his lunar escapade. He was the only golfer to ever swing on the moon. It's not just golf balls that astronauts left behind on their trips. There were actually a lot of objects left on the moon between 1969 and 1972, the year of the last moon landing. Each time you gaze up at the moon, remember that there's a cute family photo up there, some huge science gadgets, a small statue, a bunch of, well, human waste bags, and yes, some American flags. Years have passed by, and yes, technically those items are still hanging out there, though they've probably seen better days because of the harsh conditions on the moon. Some items had a special place in the astronauts' hearts and were meant to stay on the moon. But hey, leaving some stuff behind also meant they could bring back moon samples. You know the feeling. It's like when you need to make room in your suitcase for souvenirs when you're finishing a vacation. Does NASA have a complete list of things they left on the moon? Well, not really. In fact, one team tried to create a record of some of the items and reached an amazing list of 106 left there from the Apollo 11 mission alone. And that's not counting Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin's famous footprints. The largest items at each landing site were mostly the sciencey stuff, like pieces of their lunar module and experiments to study the moon in depth. Then there were some beautiful tokens, like Apollo 11's plaque and a special disc with messages from leaders around the world. Some say the astronauts also took medals to remember some heroic cosmonauts, and they even left a gold olive branch, an age-old symbol of peace. Now, later moon missions had a little more fun, like Alan Shepard did with his golf game. But the award for the most heartwarming moment goes to Charlie Duke. During the Apollo 16 mission, he left a picture of his family up there. It's like he wanted them to be a part of the adventure. Although, a heads up, those photos probably didn't age well because of the moon's high exposure to the sun's radiation. There might just be an art museum up there on our satellite too. Let me explain. There is this tiny little art piece called the Moon Museum. It's a ceramic chip about the size of your nail, and it was crafted by an artist named Forrest Myers. This tiny object showcases miniature artworks from 6 talented people. Among them are even the famous Andy Warhol, the same artist known for his iconic soup cans and celebrity portraits. Forrest Myers said he wanted his mini museum to be on the moon, but there was a problem. NASA officials weren't exactly on board with the idea. However, Myers shared with the press that he handed over this art chip to an engineer working on the Apollo 12 mission. According to Myers, this engineer secretly tucked the Moon Museum onto a leg of the lunar lander. In case you haven't figured it out yet, these lunar landers don't come back to Earth after their mission. Take this with a grain of salt though, as NASA has never confirmed this story. You might wonder, why did they leave all these things? Sometimes it was about making a statement. Other times, it was purely practical. At one point, it was mentioned that during the Apollo 11 mission, for example, a decision needed to be made. The astronauts had to quickly figure out what was essential for their trip back home. They ended up creating a cleanup spot, tossing away things they didn't need anymore. Leaving things behind on the moon isn't that different from how we leave things behind on Earth, just like archaeologists study our ancient leftovers to learn about our ancestors. The stuff on the moon gives us insights about those incredible lunar missions. Some things they left had done their job, like the pole for the flag or the camera they used to broadcast those steps on the moon. Even the tools astronauts used to collect samples were left because they had more precious cargo to bring back: moon rocks. When it comes to the current state of all these items, scientists are not entirely sure. We do know that NASA's Moon Observer has spotted some of their shadows. They're still up there. The official gear was built to resist, so it might behave a bit better. But those personal items? They've probably seen better days.